Now may I invite my favorite editor, one of the last great editors, if I might say so, in case I offend some editors here, one of the last great editors, T.N. Ninan, who's changed the way of thinking of a whole generation of journalists, nurtured them, mentored them, and made them better journalists. But T.N. Ninan is not only an editor, he's also an economic thinker, an analyst, and a brilliant columnist. So now may I invite Mr. Ninan to please give the B.G. Verghese Memorial Lecture.
Thank you, Bharat, and good evening, friends, jury members, award winners, a lot of friendly faces in the room, and thank you to the Media Foundation for inviting me to give this lecture. At the outset, I'd like to congratulate Pritika and Grishma, our two award winners. You've come through a rigorous screening process, and the recognition given to you this evening is a tribute to the quality of your work. And since you are women, I should mention what B.G. Verghese said in his memoirs about his stint as editor of the Hindustan Times. He wrote, quote, "I found the women distinctly superior," this is his colleagues in the paper, and had, you have to listen to the rest of it, and had no hesitation in taking them on despite murmurs about their not being put on late shifts, the likelihood of their getting married and going away, or seeking maternity leave, the need to allot them separate toilets, and so on. We were pioneers in the feminization of our workforce. I think I'd be right in saying that there is almost no resistance today to hiring women as journalists. They are in abundance in most of our newsrooms, though there are still quite few at the top as editors. Other than the Hindustan Times, which Verghese edited for about 7 years, he also served as the editor of the Indian Express for 4 years. He came to HT from being a member of Indira Gandhi's staff as information advisor. Verghese was a man with many opinions, and some would say many hobby horses. So he had taken to sending Mrs. Gandhi long policy memos on subjects that had little to do with the media. She wasn't interested, so he left for the Hindustan Times. There he became steadily more disenchanted with her politics, and it showed in the paper's coverage. Political pressure built up on the paper's proprietor to change the editor, and what followed was something extraordinary. When colleagues in the paper realized that their editor was about to be changed under political pressure, they set up an impromptu committee, collected money, and took the case to the Press Council. There they argued that press freedom meant the freedom of the editor, not the proprietor. The paper went to the Delhi High Court, saying that these journalists had no case. It lost in the High Court, but went in appeal. Eventually, the court said the proprietor could determine policy, but everything else lay with the editor. But a day later, Verghese was sacked on the office staircase as he was about to leave home at 9 o'clock. To tell you where she stood, Mrs. Gandhi then abolished the Press Council. The whole episode speaks of a more innocent time when journalists believed that editorial freedom should and could be protected even if, or especially if, the proprietor was making political compromises. It was also a time when public institutions held true to their mission. But there was a lesson in the fact that eventually the proprietor had his way. On a personal note, I got my first journalistic job at the Hindustan Times when Verghese was its editor. So did my wife, Shevanti. It is therefore a personal honor for me to deliver a lecture named for an accomplished editor whose range of interests went well beyond the newspapers he edited. One of the things about Verghese was that he didn't believe in just cursing the darkness. He also wanted to shed light on solutions. In a journalistic world full of weary cynics, Verghese believed that things could be improved. So today, I would like to take a leaf out of the Verghese book and go beyond describing our many failures on the jobs front. I also want to point to some silver linings and to look for possible solutions. And so to the subject before us, jobs and wages and old and new challenges. Sometimes I think that our national sport is not cricket, but playing with numbers, statistics. We play with GDP numbers, poverty numbers, employment numbers, consumption numbers, and you'll ask, how's the game played? That's simple. By using the same numbers to arrive at completely opposite conclusions. There's only one thing that you can safely say. If an economist uses macro statistics to assert that the economy is doing well, he is, of course, pro-BJP. And if someone says the opposite, well, of course, he's anti-BJP. All other assertions on the basis of macroeconomic data are open to question. So my request to you this evening is, let's put our politics aside and discuss an economic issue on its own terms. In what I'm going to say, I will first outline what I think is the nature of our employment market and argue that the problem is as much incomes as it is jobs. Second, I'll point to some bright spots in an otherwise grim picture to make the point that we can hope for change. Third, I will look at the solutions that have been suggested for improving the situation and explain why I think they fall short, and then offer some thoughts of my own, including on the need to pay out a monthly income support. Fourth, I will look at the employment challenges posed by artificial intelligence, and I will close with some thoughts on the increasing imbalance of power between employer and employee, and consider some directions for policy. I'll request your attention for about half an hour from here on. So let's start with the unemployment numbers. The government says it is 3% or less. That may or may not be correct in a technical sense, but in a broader sense, the number is plainly delusional, because only about 58% of our population in the working age group of a billion people actually works. In the past, it has been higher at around 65%, which is about the level in many countries. In China, it's even higher than 65. The missing 7% of those who've dropped out from 65 to 58%, those missing 7% have joined people who are not looking for work. They've simply dropped out of the labor market. We're talking of some 70 million people. Next, let's look at employment in agriculture. This involves close to half our workforce. While there are variations, farm incomes are invariably low because too many people produce too little. We don't need 250 million people to produce what our agriculture does. China produces 2.5 times as much with 175 million people. That's 30% less than us in agriculture. If our agriculture were properly organized, anything up to 100 million workers could leave our farms without agricultural output suffering. Income per head would then go up for those who remain in agriculture. So why are so many excess numbers engaged in farming? The answer is that they have nowhere else to go. In fact, after the COVID disruption, millions of additional workers have gone back to working on farms, which is truly bizarre. So now even more people depend on farming income. So it is only natural that 155 million have registered under the Rural Employment Guarantee Program. The other trend is that the number of women engaged in unpaid work has seen a sharp increase. Some of them might be available for paid work if it were available. Taking the surplus workers on farms, the additional numbers that have dropped out of the labor market, and the increase in the number of women doing unpaid work, anything up to 200 million could be either working or working more productively if the labor market offered them suitable opportunities. Household incomes would see a sharp increase, since it is mostly women in the working age group who either opted out or are doing unpaid work. In this context, the 3% unemployment figure makes little sense. Meanwhile, The fortunate ones at the top end of the market mostly work for a regular salary, plus there are employers. That's close to a quarter of the total numbers employed. Within that group, the organized sector, which means establishments of at least 20 workers, is only about 17% of the total. 1/6 of the total are in the organized sector. That comprises 76 million who are now members of the Employment Provident Fund scheme and another 10 million or thereabouts in various governments. These 86 million support families comprising up to 350 million people. That's a quarter of our population and a larger number than the entire population of any other country, with China being the obvious exception. This is the top-end segment, 350 million people out of 1,400, that drives much of our consumption and growth, and which makes India among the top 3 or 4 markets in the world for everything from cars and aviation to mobile phones and home appliances. The rest of the workforce comprises casual laborers, self-employed people, and those on contract. They are semi-skilled or skilled tradespeople on construction sites, in our mandis and retail markets, people plying traditional crafts or more contemporary ones in small establishments like power looms and diamond cutting centers. We also see them all around us as drivers of trucks and cars, security guards, roadside vendors, domestic help, and increasingly as delivery boys, gig workers who lead a precarious existence financially and often physically. There are 2 elements that we don't have enough of in this mosaic. One is women, as I mentioned, and the other is large-scale factory employment, which hasn't grown the way it has in many other countries. We'll come to why in a moment. Given this broad structure of our workforce, my first substantive point is that our bigger problem is the nature of employment rather than unemployment, and the fact that so much of it is of low value, providing low incomes. We have most people off the poverty line, but in their place, we have hundreds of millions who live uncertain lives on the edge with no margin of safety. Most of them work for less than the minimum wage, let alone the more generously defined living wage. And just to be clear, in Delhi, the minimum wage is about 17,500, and the living wage for an average family is about 25,000. Getting people up to that higher standard requires, first and most important, a better educated workforce. But though we have almost universalized school enrollment, we offer little real or quality education. I would wish that some of the money being poured into the physical infrastructure, badly needed as it is, but ego projects like bullet trains would be spent more usefully on improving our education system. I turn now to some of the silver linings in this otherwise somewhat grim picture, because the labor market seems to find its own solutions in a growing regional imbalance where there is actually a shortage of workers now in quite a few states. That shortage has been met by migrants from the heartland. States like Tamil Nadu and Kerala are into a population transition because their total fertility rate has fallen well below the replacement level of 2.1 births per woman. Tamil Nadu's TFR is as low as 1.4 and Kerala is 1.5. Even West Bengal is down to 1.4. Believe it or not, that is about the same as the 1.5 average in the European Union. These states will soon see their population shrinking. And this spells a huge opportunity for workers in the heartland states to migrate south and west. Indeed, half the workers in the industrial town of Tirupur and Tamil Nadu are now said to be Hindi-speaking. Most of us are not fully aware of the scale of this interstate migration. The 2011 census, that's 13 years ago, put the figure at 41 million. It would be a very much bigger number now. Migration usually raises income levels or people would not migrate. I happened to be in Chennai in January and got in touch with an old colleague from Business Standard. He said he had just rebuilt his family home in an old temple town an hour or 2 outside Chennai. He had used a labor contractor to get workers from Bihar to work on his house construction for a daily wage of 850 rupees. I was pleasantly surprised at the high wage level and he told me that if he had hired local labor, it would have cost him 1100 per day. So I asked around, and it turned out that migrant workers from the heartland states do get wages in Tamil Nadu that are multiples of what they would get back home. Similar, for some categories, that's similar even to the wages which until now you could see only in Kerala. For some categories, the daily wage rate crosses into 4 digits, as I mentioned, but for others, it may drop to 600. On a monthly basis, most migrants in these 2 states particularly seem to earn more than the minimum wage. Some even get what would qualify as a living wage. There is a similar picture broadly in states like Punjab, Gujarat and Maharashtra, even Rajasthan, as we saw during the COVID shutdown, when millions of migrants in these states had to find their way back home to their villages further east. Uttarakhand today has a higher consumption level than Maharashtra, according to the latest consumption numbers. If that's so, it's because of the migrants from Garhwal and Kumaon who work in and around Delhi. So we have an emerging picture down the geographical spine of the country, where there is actually a labor shortage. Surplus labor from further east gets absorbed in these states. Migration has its costs. Migrant workers usually live in poor conditions. They've almost always left their families behind in the village, where their wives look after old parents and mind the farm perhaps, and children grow up without a father. These are not ideal social conditions, but the situation in the heartland would be far more distressing without the migration phenomenon. I therefore count this as a silver lining. The more straightforward good news story is that about the growth of the organized sector. The numbers here are still modest, but if you look at the Provident Fund organization, its contributing membership has been growing rapidly from about 45 million a few years ago to a current figure of 75.6 million, as reported on the organization website. Now, EPFO numbers are sort of hard to put together in a coherent way because the numbers sometimes contradict themselves, but these are the best estimates. 75.6 million is on the website. 45 million is a number that was given in answer to a question in Parliament, so I take them as at least broadly reliable. And this rapid growth suggests that we could see further rapid growth in the coming years. And so that means that already close to 30% of our non-agricultural workforce is now in the organized sector. And if these trends continue, where the numbers being enrolled in Provident Fund seem to be in excess of 10 million a year, we could potentially have half the non-farm workforce in the organized sector with Provident Fund membership in the next 5 or 7 years. This would bring about a qualitative change in our labor market and potentially drive up wages in even the unorganized sector. Alternatively, it would pull more workers off the farms. Either way, it's a very positive development as I see it. There is a third sign of change. I had said that India has not managed the large-scale movement of workers from farm to factory, largely because of mistaken policies. But change has begun in some of the more prosperous states again, where the percentage of workers engaged in agriculture has fallen substantially from a national average of about 45 to 50%. Kerala and Punjab are close to the Chinese level of having only about a quarter of their workforce engaged in agriculture. That's half the national average. Haryana has less than 30%. Even in West Bengal, only a third of the workers are now on farms. The twist is that most of the people who moved out of farming have not gone to work in factories, but into the unorganized labor market. This is less than ideal, but one must assume that they're earning more than they would have on the farm, or they would not have moved out. To sum up what I have spelled out so far, the overall employment situation provides massive challenges. But there are at least 3 signs of positive change. People from the poorer states are migrating to places where they get work at better wages. Second, the organized sector of the job market is growing quite rapidly, and this too means higher wages. And third, the numbers dependent on agriculture have come down in some states. I call these silver linings because the overall national picture still tells us that wage levels are not rising very fast. But clearly, on the margin, there is change happening. There may still be some way off before we can see fundamental change in the structure of the national employment market. But I do think that future change may be more substantive and come faster, or at least we can hope so. I turn therefore to the third part of my lecture to ask the question, how could faster change be brought about? The standard economic argument is that we need more factories to absorb surplus labor from agriculture. This has been the traditional route taken by most economies, but I am skeptical about whether it will happen in India on the scale required. Successive governments have tried to address the factors that are set to stand in the way of rapid manufacturing growth. They have changed labor laws, improved our transport and other infrastructure, lowered corporate tax rates, offered incentives and subsidies to get new industries going. So far, though, the share of manufacturing in the economy and the share of labor engaged in manufacturing both have remained stubbornly static. It is possible that at some point the cumulative impact of the changes gets us over the threshold so that rapid industrialization finally begins to happen. This may well happen in the coming years with foreign investors looking for an alternative to China as a manufacturing base and given the increasing attractions of the large and growing Indian market. The government on its part has made clear that access to the Indian market depends on a manufacturing base being set up in the country. So tariffs have been raised for many imports, incentives and subsidies are being offered to those investing in India, and at least some international companies seem more interested in India than before. So why am I skeptical? I think there are four hard truths about rapid job creation in the manufacturing sector. First, you don't create enough industrial jobs by catering to only the domestic market. However big the home market may seem, the world market is bigger. So you have to export if enterprises are to acquire global scale. But the great age of globalization is winding down as country after country gets defensive and protective of home markets. Export success now is more difficult than it was a decade or two ago. An industrial policy that is outward focused also requires a different approach from the government's present focus, which is primarily on import substitution. Second, industrial automation has reached a stage where you won't create the same number of jobs as before, even in manufacturing sectors that are considered labor intensive. Third, if you think cheap labor is your competitive advantage, countries like Bangladesh and perhaps even Vietnam offer still lower wages. Vietnam additionally offers higher productivity. And fourth, factory efficiency requires well-educated workers, and our school system still lacks quality. Finally, you need an efficient infrastructure so that transport, electricity, and other costs are low and competitive. Of the five, the only big change is that the Indian ecosystem has become more welcoming. Electricity shortages, once endemic, have disappeared. Work stoppages in terms of strikes and lockouts have become rare. Goods move much faster from factory to port by rail and on new highways. Our ports have substantially improved their efficiency. Customs procedures have got better. But the other constraints remain. So my guess is that there will be more industrial jobs in the foreseeable future, but the structural change that we want remains over the horizon. Meanwhile, Raghuram Rajan and Rohit Lamba, in their recent book titled Breaking the Mold, have argued that the future for India lies not so much in manufacturing as in services. And by services they mean not barbers or Uber drivers, but high-end services. The research-driven creation of intellectual property, giving birth thereby to the Indian equivalents of companies like Apple. They recognize that this can be done only with high-quality education, especially scientific and technical education. Frankly, I'm even more skeptical about this thesis than the more traditional one about manufacturing. I don't see us delivering what Dr. Rajan wants from our education system, but we can't even fix our school system. It is true that our tech services companies have been trailblazers and created millions of high-end jobs, and that's because we have quality IITs plus some new quality private universities. But even they don't do cutting-edge research. To the extent that such research is taking place in India, it is in the local units of global companies. So it's hard to see how this can be the primary solution to our employment problem. If manufacturing and services are at best partial solutions, why not look for the end game in agriculture? This is not what people usually say, so I want to spell out in some detail what I have in mind. One of the reasons for low incomes in farming is that crop productivity per hectare in most crops is well below the best levels achieved in other countries. Whether it is rice, wheat, cotton, mangoes, fresh vegetables, potatoes, tomatoes, chickpeas, you name it, India's productivity compares poorly, indeed very poorly. The gap in most cases between our productivity and the best in the world is large enough to be positively embarrassing. For instance, experts from Israel who studied our mango cultivation some years ago said that if we change the spacing of mango trees and did some intercropping, the income from mango groves could multiply, could double, or even treble. So there's plenty of scope for increasing agricultural incomes by boosting productivity. You don't have to get to global levels, but you can increase it substantially. We can also boost agricultural incomes by giving up on our tendency to clamp down on farm product prices every time food inflation inches up. Our desire to protect consumers from inflation usually comes at the cost of the farmer. We ban exports of crops, we hasten to import them, we unload government stocks at well below procurement prices. All of these depress agricultural product prices and affect farmer income. Third, it should be possible to encourage the cultivation of more labor-intensive crops. Wheat is among the least labor-intensive, whereas rice requires more labor on account of the need for transplanting. But new rice seeding techniques are taking away the need for transplanting. Other crops like cotton are also labor-intensive. One cannot expect any large-scale change in cropping patterns, but every partial solution contributes to the total solution. The most substantial way of increasing farm-related work is not on the farm itself, but off it, by fostering enterprises that use local crops to add value and create employment. I point to the Sahyadri Farmer Producer Company in Maharashtra, which sources the supply of tomatoes and creates local employment for sorting, grading, and packing tomatoes, which Sahyadri then exports to some 42 countries. It is also a contract manufacturer of ketchup. Tomato prices are volatile, so Sahyadri Farm offers farmers a year-round minimum price at the bottom end and a 1 rupee price premium over the market at the top end, which is the kind of assurance farmers need in order to minimize market risk without state intervention or subsidy. Another example is Araku coffee, which you may have heard about, grown organically by tribals in the Eastern Ghats near Visakhapatnam and exported as artisanal coffee. Researchers have calculated profits from growing coffee in the Araku Valley at 2.3 lakh rupees per hectare. An even more impressive example of a successful agro-enterprise is the Synthites Group, located an hour from Kochi in Kerala, which now accounts for 30% of the global market for oleoresins. The company processes Kerala's varied spices to create a range of products for use as food flavoring and in the perfume industry. Having visited Synthites, I can tell you it is an inspirational story. A homegrown but world-class enterprise located in rural Kerala, with operations and facilities now in several southern states and indeed overseas. Its success is such that Kerala now can't produce enough of the spices that Synthites needs for processing, so it imports raw spices from Vietnam. In Maharashtra, there's also the story of Maha Grapes, set up in 1991 with 16 grape grower cooperative societies as members. A Maha Grapes team went out to explore the world grape market and studied Chile's success in the business. The lead was then picked up by Mahindra Agro, which is now the leading exporter of grapes and okra procured locally. There are many such enterprises, but many of them are yet to acquire scale. The exceptions, which we all know about, are Amul and the sugar cooperatives and companies like Synthites. But even Sahyadri, Araku, and Mahindra Coffee are firmly established and can grow. These and others harness technology to develop products, set up marketing links, and establish brands. Being situated close to the farms where their raw materials are grown, they create employment locally so that surplus farm workers don't have to migrate to cities in search of work. Looking to agriculture and agro-based industries for one of the solutions to our employment and incomes problem is not to look backward as you may think. Fisheries are Norway's biggest export after oil and gas, and its salmon fishing business is organized into sales cooperatives. So are California's almond growers, who account for 80% of the world's almonds. Our state governments, I think, should be doing far more to encourage the birth and growth of farmer-producer companies, because building businesses and exports from our agricultural base is, to my mind, a surer way of creating large-scale employment in the places where workers are. It is, therefore, a more realistic solution for both the jobs and incomes problems than expecting 100 million agricultural workers to migrate to where our large factories are set up, usually in urban areas that are poorly administered. What do we do until these and other initiatives change the dynamics of our employment market? I would argue that we've probably reached a stage where there is some kind of income subvention, we've probably reached a stage where some kind of income subvention to about half of our 300 million families has become inescapable. You could say this is a dole when money could be spent more productively on investments that create jobs. But we really have no immediate solution to the double problem of low productivity work and low incomes. Whatever solutions we work out will take time, and we cannot expect people to wait indefinitely for things to change. Financial payouts are already given to widows, old people, the differently abled, and farmers. But these are selective, and the sums are inadequate. The time may have come for subsuming all such payments into a basic income support program. If, for argument's sake, 3,000 rupees are provided every month as a subvention to support 150 million families over and above what they already make, the net additional cost would be perhaps about 1% of GDP. That money could be raised without difficulty through a hike in the GST rate, and if needed, by tweaking corporate and individual tax rates. I turn now to the challenges posed by artificial intelligence, or AI. It's really too early to say whether this will be a non-revolution like 3D printing or something as momentous as the discovery of electricity and the internal combustion engine. At the moment, it looks more like the latter, partly because of the incredible speed at which AI is developing. In just 10 years, the amount of computation power used to train AI models has increased by 10 billion times. Processing that took weeks now gets done in seconds. And the horizons for AI are constantly expanding. Elon Musk has declared that AI would be, quote, the most destructive force in history, unquote. Till not long ago, and that means maybe a year or just some months, the belief was that automation would take over mostly routine work. But it is now clear that AI will reach out much further and step onto the turf of highly educated and well-paid workers in non-routine functions. They could even get creative. One of the demands of the script writers in Hollywood who went on strike last year was that producers would restrict the use of AI in generating film scripts. In a recent test, 453 people were given writing assignments, with half of them allowed to use ChatGPT. Those who had ChatGPT took 40% less time to conclude their assignment, and their output was judged to be 18% better in quality. The McKinsey Global Institute forecasts that 15% of the global workforce will be displaced in just 6 years. Technological change has affected workers before, even eliminated whole categories of work, but perhaps not at the speed or on the scale that is now being predicted. Governments and societies need to harness and direct the change. Darren Acemoglu and Simon Johnson argue in their new book, Power and Progress, that the changes which technology brings about depend on the policies we adopt to direct technological development and then the policies that determine its use. In other words, they argue technology does not develop autonomously, it depends on how we want it to develop. We know that AI can boost productivity. The question is, will it also lead to better shared prosperity? AI could be a productivity booster in fields as diverse as agriculture and medicine, warfare, of course, and even software coding. But the question is, will it aid farmers and factory workers in their work or replace them? Will it create more jobs than the old ones that inevitably will get lost? For some preliminary answers and the potential dilemmas, let's look at the specifics of how AI might be used. Will we encourage self-driven cars when India has millions of car drivers who might be put out of work? This is an unusual market where one-third of cars, according to Maruti, are driven by drivers, they're not self-driven. So self-driven cars have the potential of a huge displacement of workers. In the US, there is actually a shortage of truck drivers, so they might push for having self-driven trucks. But there is no shortage of truck drivers in India. So should we encourage self-driven trucks? And if we don't, will we be blocking technological progress? Meanwhile, call center work that has been offshored to India may get reshored back to the home countries if AI demolishes India's labor cost advantage. That could spell disaster for us. So how far should factory automation go? The Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, has called for a human-centric AI. What does that mean? For instance, governments have to ask whether they can tax wages more than they tax capital. Have we created a fiscal bias towards automation? Will we put as much money into retraining workers as we put into AI research? At the moment, we have more questions than answers, but these questions must be addressed and appropriate policies evolved. Finally, we may have to take a hard look at the results of such labor policy reform as we have introduced. When we pushed for a more flexible labor market as a way of attracting investors and boosting industrial investment, what was the compact with organized labor? The compact was that if they gave up on the extreme job security they enjoyed, more jobs would be created and more people would get jobs. Today the question is, has it happened? Or is it just that the conditions of employment have become more one-sided, with employment growth confined largely to the contract segment and to gig workers? The data is quite striking. By 2021-22, it's 2 years ago, according to data from the annual survey of industries, 2 out of every 5 industrial employees were on contract. That's 40% of the total. In 4 years till then, there was only 5% growth in the regular roles of companies, 5%. At the same time, in the same period, the number of people employed on contract surged by 23%. That's 4.5 times as much in contract. Was this the intended result of labor law reform? Niti Aayog now says that the number of gig workers will treble to some 24 million by 2030. That will account for another big chunk of new jobs created. And a survey report says this week that gig workers like cab drivers and delivery boys invariably work 10 to 14 hours a day and more. Yet, more than 70% of them find it hard to make ends meet. Do we think this is okay, or should we do something about the working conditions of gig workers? Some state governments have begun to address these issues. And to be fair, the new labor codes stipulate that contract labor must be paid the same wages and benefits as regular employees. The codes also have various provisions for unorganized sector workers, such as making safety net benefits available to them for a small fee. The key question is whether these provisions will remain on paper, as many have in the past. At the moment, the new codes have yet to come into effect, though 4 years have passed since legislative approval. so we can only pose the questions. What AI does is to give a new urgency to the questions that are already before us. For instance, what do we do with those workers who will inevitably get displaced because of the use of AI? One of the new labor codes provides for a certain amount of money to be paid to any worker if she or he gets retrenched. This is to be over and above the normal retrenchment payout, and the stipulation is that the extra money must be used for retraining. The question is, even if such money is provided, will retraining happen? Do we have retraining programs in place? To repeat, I do believe that we need a flexible labor market, but we also need to address the growing imbalance of power between employer and employee. AI, with its simultaneous promise and threat, should hasten thought and, where required, corrective action. In closing, I'd like to offer a brief insight into the tribulations of our educated unemployed, to give some sense of the harsh realities in the job market, particularly for those who have some kind of post-school education. And I will take an example from UP, where some 4.8 million people are apparently willing to become police constables. 4.8 million. And they are upset that the exam to fill 67,000 vacancies has been postponed. Millions of others, or maybe the same people, want to sit for exams in the state to become what are called review officers and assistant review officers, ROs and AROs. Now, an ARO with the officer tag is a nice new term for a clerical job, and it offers the prospect of becoming a full-fledged RO with pay that could eventually go up to 1.4 lakh per month. So who wouldn't want to be an ARO? But to become an ARO, you have to write an exam and answer some tricky questions. For instance, you're asked to give the sequence in which the following were discovered: the pi meson, the neutron, electron, and proton. That's one question. Then you are expected to know whether the UP budget is 84,833 crore, or more or less. And is Sreta Thavisin the first woman chairperson of the Railway Board, or the Prime Minister of Thailand, or the author of Tales from Banana Republic? Or, if a semi-permeable membrane is placed between the solvent and the solution, in which direction will the solvent molecules flow? Would any of us qualify to become an ARO? So we can laugh or we can shudder at the prospect of having to, as they say, ratify such random facts from physics, economics, international affairs, chemistry, and yet other fields. And the people who set those questions seem to think that you need to know all this in order to function as an ARO. The only way to prepare for such an exam is to get hold of a leaked exam paper and then ratify. Since the stakes are high, the incentive for leaking are also high. So in state after state, exam papers get leaked, and then the exams get postponed, which raises frustration levels for all those millions who would want to be police constables and AROs. But wait, the state government gives the consolation prize to these frustrated youngsters: free bus travel for the next trip to the exam center. Someone in Lucknow has a sense of humor. Thank you.
Absolutely brilliant. Thank you, Mr. Ninan, for that brilliant, comprehensive, and at times funny and sad commentary on unemployment in India. I, for one, always get confused between the CMI data, the data from the periodic labor survey, World Bank data on unemployment, because nothing matches. But after hearing him, a lot of things have started making sense to me, and I hope they made sense to you too. I hope we'll be able to put this on our site, both the lecture and the and the YouTube recording of the lecture. So we can sort of see it, read it in greater detail. And I think it has a lot of pointers on understanding the nature of unemployment in India and what AI can or cannot do. Now, may I invite our treasurer, Nupur Basu, eminent documentary filmmaker, to give a token of our appreciation to the speaker, Mr. T.N. Ninan. This is not an unemployment dole, although you are unemployed, but do please accept it. This is all we can do.
Thank you, Nupur. Well, that brings us to the close of what has been a truly rewarding, riveting evening. I would now like to thank all those who made today's program possible. Mrs. Devaki Jain and her son, eminent journalist Srinivasan Jain, for sponsoring the Chameli Devi Jain Award. The Verghese family, especially the late B.G. Verghese's sons Vijay and Rahul, for supporting the Media Foundation. Mr. T.N. Ninan for giving the B.G. Verghese Memorial Lecture. The jury members, Radhika Ramaseshan, Mariam Alavi, and Richard Mahapatra for their time. Special thanks to jury chair Radhika Ramaseshan for her hard work. Thanks also to this year's winners, Grishma Kutar and Ritika Chopra, for accepting the award and for being present today. A very big thank you to Mr. Shyam Saran, President of IIC, and Mr. K. N. Srivastava, Director of IIC, for their continuous support. Many thanks to the Chief of Program Division of the IIC, Lal Somlyani Tochong, I hope I got that right, better known as Tete, for being there for us at all times. Thanks also to former TMF Secretary Manika Chopra for her guidance. Thanks to the current chair, Mr. Bharat Bhushan, and members of the Media Foundation for your active involvement and cooperation. And of course, all the brilliant, brilliant women journalists who applied for the award. Last but not the least, thank you all for being such a wonderful audience. Thank you and good night.